Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking, and as always, great to have you along for another episode of Classic Fights. And we've got a ripper fights for you in this series, just like we did last week when Pacquiao and Marquez fought over those four memorable fights. This week, we've got a trilogy, and it's brought to you by a bit of a stranger of the show in the last few weeks, Tassie Brown. How are you, Tassie?
Good, thanks, Lyndon. It's great to be back, mate, repping the MGA, Mike Tamura, number one, best in the business. And, it's good to be back, mate. It's it's been a while.
And, of course, the man he speaks of down the bottom right-hand corner there, Mike Tamura. Great to have you back again, Mike. You've been a bit of a crutch for all the shows in the last few weeks, but it's great to have you along and obviously in conjunction with Tassie there.
Well, by accident almost. I'm rocking a bit of the Tassie Brown mantra, which is resistance, because he's resisted following the crowds in Australian boxing for 30 plus years. So it's a pleasure to be back.
Mike, the only thing I've got to say,
the fight choice this week.
Oh, it is. Before we get on to that, I just want to say one thing. Where's my jacket? That's all I want to say. Tassie up there's got his jacket. I don't remember getting mine. Maybe it got lost in the mail.
I've got a Hosking boxing T-shirt here somewhere. I'll have to roll it out. Yeah.
Get it on. It's might be making a comeback soon. So what's that, Tassie?
It's just great to be around boxing knowledgeable people like yourselves, mate. Guys with high boxing IQs, guys that live the sport, and know the sport. So it's good to be on with such likes as yourselves, you know.
Great stuff, mate. Now, this week was your choice, Tassie. And as I said, I'm really liking the trilogy. I had to go back and watch the fights again. Of course, we're talking about this one, James Toney, Mike McCALLUM, the series. Now, Tassie, tell us a little bit about why you chose this trilogy.
I chose it. I mean, I think I've had James Toney on before versus Roy Jones. But, I mean, I love James Toney. James Toney, to me, is one of the greatest fighters of all time, especially my era. Obviously, I'm a real 90s child, man. You know? But I really wanted to focus on Mike McCALLUM because Mike McCALLUM is one of the greatest fighters of all time. I believe he was just outside the Fabulous Four. He never got a Leonard Hearns, Duran or Hagler. You got to remember, Mike McCALLUM knocked out the great Julian Jackson. He knocked out the great Donald Curry. He was pretty much unbeatable at light middleweight. And I got him down as I got Tommy Hearns as number one, light middleweight ever, but I got Mike McCALLUM as number two. He was amazing. He goes up the middleweight. He has the one loss. He revenges that. And he's got the WBA title at the time. They strip him because he fights Toney for the IBF. But it could have been champion versus champion. Mike McCALLUM, for those that don't know him, one of the greatest fighters of all time. And so is James Toney. So I remember they had a trilogy. I remember one or two were controversial. I've only just got to rewatch number one. And I didn't get to watch number two. I wanted to recap number two. But I think there was a bit of controversy, I think, in number two. I don't believe it should have been, the way it ended in number one either. I won't give it away. But just two great fighters that I believed. I mean, Mike McCALLUM come back and beat Hitman Harden at light heavyweight as well. I mean, so I wanted to mention both guys. I'm a massive Toney fan, but I wanted to shine a bit of a light onto Mike McCALLUM because if you don't know him, guys, research him. He is one of the greatest that have ever laced up gloves.
He is the body snatcher, wasn't he, Mike? And just as we're getting talking, I'm going to run the vision because we've got three fights to get through. But he was seriously underrated, wasn't he, Mike? Because I remember actually seeing him the first time on the Marvin Hagler Mustafa Ham show undercard back in 1983, and he beat the fighter named Sean Mannion for the vacant WBA junior middleweight title. And after that, he was pretty much unstoppable at that weight, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that was a hard, tough 15-round fight against Irish Sean Mannion. And was kind of a coming out party for McCALLUM, or should have acted as one. But he was one of those guys that just, the timing of his career to the point of this fight with Toney just never really seemed to align. So he looked to be a lock for the 1980 Olympics, and then of course all the boycotts and so forth played out, and he wound up just sitting out and then turned pro, I believe it was in 1981. But he was an exceptionally solid amateur out of Kingston, Jamaica. Then had a lot of management problems throughout his pro career, which is probably why he didn't land some of those bigger fights, and then was always deemed just to be that little bit, we always talk about risk versus reward. He was the risk that was no reward to any of the Fabulous Four, and so he was overlooked for the biggest fights, but his track record really spoke for itself. And even Tassie did a great job there listing some of his victories, especially the knockout victories, the likes of Julian Jackson, Donald Curry. Add to that as well, he beat a 41-1 Harold Graham in the UK when Graham was expected to outbox him, and Graham's probably one of the best middleweights of all time, never to win a world title. Just prior, about a year and a half before this fight, he had beaten Steve Collins, who went on to become the first man to beat Chris Eubank, and a very, very solid world champion. And this fight was kind of like a coming out party for him, whereas it was a bit of a test for James Toney. James Toney shocked the world with 11th round stoppage over the unbeaten Michael Nunn. But then coming out of that, had a very tight call, got knocked down heavy, and won what was considered a debatable decision over Reggie Johnson, another great middleweight of the era, future two-division world champion. And so there was probably more question marks coming into this bout on Toney than there was McCALLUM.
Yeah, there was, and you mentioned about Mike McCALLUM being. I know we did the Aaron Pryor Miguel Cotto dream fight last week, and he reminds me a little bit about the Aaron Pryor syndrome, where he's just too good to get those big fights, and maybe doesn't have the appeal and the draw of some of those bigger opponents, which is why he doesn't actually get those big fights. But this fight in particular, the first one here, took place on December 13th, 1991. It's for the IBF middleweight title, Convention Hall. We've lost Tassie there. We'll get him back in a sec. Convention Hall in Atlantic City. Toney was 28-0-1 going in. McCALLUM was 42-1. And the other fighter we didn't mention before that McCALLUM had actually beat was Milton McCrory, was another former world champion. And of course, as we said, Donald Curry. He did have that loss against Sambu Kalumbay, another very, very underrated fighter, but he's just one of those fighters who, as I said, if you're one of those greats, you can't blame him for staying away from him, because he was just one of those fighters who could really beat any of those guys on the night.
Yeah, absolutely. And he just seemed ageless for so many years. He had a style that kind of played well into his 30s. If you look even here, just very, very energy efficient, good jab, good reaction time. You see there, like just them little subtle movements to evade from Toney. Like a lot of us who've probably, especially this generation of boxing fans, watch a lot more of Toney, accustomed to seeing the movements coming from McCALLUM from Toney. So it's not quite a mirror that Toney's looking into, but you see a lot of just those little subtle step backs and then in position to counter all the time, which is why this was such a fascinating matchup, because both of them are just two master technicians.
They were, and I must admit, I watched the highlights again today. I saw the fight, obviously a long time ago, and watched the highlights again today. And one thing that really struck me is, you're right, they're almost the mirror image of each other. They both had the sort of slight shoulder roll. James Toney probably had the more pronounced shoulder roll, but McCALLUM did as well. And they traded jabs, they traded overhand rights, traded left hooks. It was a really evenly matched fight.
Yeah, welcome back, Tassie. As well, welcome back, Taz.
Sorry, guys. Someone had apologies.
It's all good, mate.
What surprised me when I went back and watched this fight was how much Toney was utilising the jabs. So even later career, he'd throw singular shots, stiff jabs or that, but he was throwing a lot of combinations off his jab in this fight, which kind of surprised me. And of course, right here, you've seen the bodywork of Mike McCALLUM. It would be remiss of us not to note his nickname, which of course was the Body Snatcher. Yeah. I think you can see why that is. But this is probably one of my favourite fights of the era, just because of the fact that, they're both going toe-to-toe, endlessly exchanging heavy shots, but neither guy appears to get tired at any point.
Taz, you were just saying, mate, about how evenly matched they sort of were, and they sort of mirrored each other. But do you agree that McCallum's probably one of the only fighters, apart from, say, Roy Jones Jr., of course, that actually matched Tony for evasive skills, technique, speed, power. He was pretty much a pretty good match for him, wasn't he?
Yeah, look, the trouble was, though, and I don't know if you would have noticed, obviously, you know how special it was. The great, marvellous Marvin Hagler was commentating this fight.
He was, yep.
So the great middleweight legend, obviously watching the next year after him. So McCALLUM was a bit older, though. So by the time he moved up the middleweight, he was in his 30s, where Tony was about 23. So there was a bit of age factor, but McCallum's skills and his experience, like Marvin mentioned about the experience. So, yeah, look, he did have the skills to box and to be very, fight on the outside, and he's a very good counter puncher. So he did have the skills of a Roy Jones Jr., probably not the speed on that or the endurance because of his age, but he did. And like Mike pointed out, Tony's left jab was working overtime, and he kept trying to counter McCallum's right hand with a right uppercut. So he was trying to do that a bit. It was a great senior saw battle. It really was.
Yeah, it was, and I actually thought McCALLUM used his jab really well too, Mike. And I think some of the stats coming through, and I think just on the age thing too, Tassie, I think he might have even been close to 35. I think McCALLUM was. I think I heard them say in the commentary, but I think there were 70 to 80 punches per round being thrown here, Mike, which is unbelievable for guys this size.
Especially with the intent in which they're throwing the shots. And like you said, I mean, McCALLUM did utilise the jab quite a bit, but his jab was more like an off-rhythm kind of jab, whereas Tony's was a bit more thudding. You know, McCALLUM would use his as a decoy to set up his other punches, whereas Tony uses as a battering ram at times.
He does. Well, you can see this is the last round here now. This fight, you can see we obviously haven't got the sound going there, but the fight was actually declared a draw. The scores were, sorry guys, I'll get us back up there. I've just blocked us out. Sorry. Was 116-112 for Tony, 115-113 for McCALLUM, and 114-114. So a draw. Guys, start with you, Tassie. Was it a fair result, or do you think it went one way or the other?
I thought it was close up until a bit, but then I thought Tony broke away. I thought Tony won the fight clearly. He hurt McCALLUM, especially obviously I think in the last round as well. But he hurt McCALLUM a few times. I think McCALLUM done some good work early, but I think Tony landed the more meaningful, harder, cleaner shots, and I'd probably give it to Tony 7 rounds to 5 or even 8-4, but probably 7-5 is probably fair. It was a good fight, but I don't think it was a draw.
What about you, Mike?
Yeah, same with Tassie. On initial watching, so this is one of those fights that actually didn't manage to watch it till I was able to land my hands on the VHS tape about a year and a half post-fact. And I was surprised because you read everything about it. It's a contentious draw. McCallum's side weren't satisfied with the result, whereas I felt on first viewing that they should have felt fortunate. And no matter how many times I watched it throughout the years, the closest I can ever card is 7-5 for Tony. But my general consensus is 8 rounds to 4 for Tony. I just thought he controlled the fight, and like Tassie said, probably a little bit fresher, a little bit younger. I thought he took over the last 4 rounds of the fight.
Yeah, I agree. And for all you younger generation out there, a video cassette is something that we used to have, and we used to go to the store and get and put it in and actually press play. None of this internet sort of stuff where you streamed and YouTube. You mightn't believe this, but YouTube never existed at some stage. There you go. That is a videotape.
One of these things.
that is a videotape. No, actually, what was on that, Michael? I'm not sure. Was there a couple of X's on that tape? I hope not. Oh, wrestling. Okay, beautiful.
Pro wrestling.
Some of my greatest memories in life was going to Blockbuster on a Friday night, renting the movies for the weekend.
It was, mate. It's the younger generation will never know. Now, Mike, just quickly before we move on to fight number 2, you said you got your hands on this a year or two after the effect. You would have been what, about 8 years old then, 8 or 9 years old?
Yeah, so let me look at the date again. Yeah, 91. So I was 8 years old when the fight was on. I would have been about 9.5 when we managed to secure the VHS tape. So, and you know how it is. Like when you read about these heroes of the ring, everything just sounds larger than life when you're young and when you're a kid. And so, and back then, it's not like now that you're on TikTok and you're just scrolling, or you're on Instagram flying through the reels. Back then, when you got a 1 hour tape, you know, it's not like now. There's a 12 round fight, and people want the fight summarized in 45 seconds. Back then, a 1 hour tape, you would watch it 5 or 6 times in a week and just keep absorbing it. So to me, it was like to be able to actually visualize what James Toney versus Mike McCALLUM would look like was fascinating growing up. And then as you get older and you work in the industry and you have the honor of meeting both guys, it just kind of adds that little bit more magic to your childhood.
Yeah, and Tassie, I remember, I don't know about you, but back in the day, I'd get was it KO magazine, Boxing Weekly, World of Boxing, and it was about, and of course there was the Aussie version, The Fist. There was about 8 different magazines you have to get everyone. That was our, I suppose, YouTube or social media back in the day. It took a whole month to read them, and then away you go again. It was. I don't think the people these days will actually understand how good a times it was.
I had the local news agency guy would have them all on hold behind the counter, and I'd go there and I'd get pretty much all the above you just mentioned then. And life was better back then. I mean,
what was your favourite?
Now, life is not better now than what it was back in our day. Simple as that.
What was your favourite magazine?
Probably, I'd have to say The Ring and KO.
I didn't mention The Ring. Yeah, I used to love KO magazine. What about you, Mike? You would have been The Ring.
Yeah, KO, and definitely, and this is something I'd have to dig out someday because you probably don't remember this, Lyndon, but I actually covered a few of your fights when I was like 11, 12 years of age for Ray Whitley's World of Boxing magazine.
Some of my fights.
So, yeah, your fights were like a one-line recap of, Lyndon versus Sean Connell or whoever you're fighting, Brett Eckerman, whoever you're fighting at the time.
Jeez,
So, yeah, I mean, it was a great era. I was drawn to KO because of the features. I thought the interviews, the fantasy fights, the preview fights with the odds, those features to me were really endearing. As a child, you're drawn to them,
Yeah, and sorry, mate. I was just going to say, you've come a long way. We get a one-line review of one of your fights back by an 11-year-old.
There was another magazine that I loved growing up as well, Mike. Well, there was a few, but I love the wrestling one though. That used to be about the NWA in that.
NWA,
yeah. Pro Wrestling Illustrated. That would have been.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get back on point, Tassie. This one, Toney McCALLUM 2, August 29th. 1992. Again, it was for the IBF middleweight title at the Reno Convention Center, of course, in Reno, Las Vegas, the biggest little city in the world, I think they call it. This time, Toney was 31-0-2, so he'd had 3 fights in that time. McCALLUM was 43-1-1, so just the one fight. So I don't know about you, Tassie. I thought this was almost a carbon copy of the first one.
Yeah, I tried to rewatch it the other day, Lyndon. I didn't get to refresh it, so my memory of this. Very good.
Well, Mike, you wouldn't need to watch it back. You probably got it etched in your brain somewhere. What are your thoughts?
What was interesting to me the most out of this fight was the postscript that neither fighter. You see this fight from the first bout, and it's not just a change in cameras or TV networks or anything, but both fighters looked to me noticeably thicker, but they both weighed in under the middleweight limit.
Yeah.
So it's no surprise that neither ever made middleweight again in their lifetime. After this bout, McCALLUM took a rest and moved to light heavy, and James Toney, his next bout, moved to super middleweight. Never went back down in weight. So I think it's reflective that the guys are getting older and starting to develop in different ways. This was a highly skilled bout. I thought that the pace was a bit slower than the first fight, but the punches seemed to have a little bit more venom on them. There was less combination punching, but more heavy-fisted exchanges in this fight.
Tassie, one thing I really got from going back right over these guys' records, sort of researching this, is the amount of activity that James Toney had. I remember I saw. I think you guys remember I mentioned that when I saw him at the Hall of Fame, one of the things he said was, "People don't realise how active I was as a fighter." And I remember thinking, yeah, I sort of remember you sort of being active, but I went back over his record. He turned pro at the end of 1988, so only had a couple of fights. In 1989, he had 12 fights. In 1990, he had 10. In 91, the year he won the title, he had 6. 92 was 5. 93 was 7. 94 was another 5. 95 was 6. And 96, he had 5. This is while he's world champion. So you're lucky to see these guys fight twice a year now. He had 56 fights in 8 years. That is just amazing.
I watched an interview with James Toney the other day, Zab Judah, Buddy McGirt, and Tommy Hearns. And before he fought Michael Nunn, he fought a 12-rounder in January, another fight in March, and then he fought for the title against Nunn and knocked him out just after that.
Yeah, in May, yep. Yeah, just amazing. And then after that, he fought another 3 times from May for the end of the year. So before this fight. So, Mike, it's just absolutely unheard of these days. I know probably Canelo might be the most active of today's fighters, but to see these guys like a world champion fighting 5 to 6 times a year, it's just unheard of, and probably will never be heard of again.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, occasionally we see fighters
they don't do
saying
no.
Yeah, we see guys in Thailand or that stay active, but the level of competition is poor, generally speaking, when they're building back up. Whereas Toney was taking pretty tough challenges. He was taking top 10, top 15 rated fighters in non-title bouts just to stay active and fighting a division up. But I remember Jackie Callan, who was his manager, noting at the time that he had that kind of schedule and that kind of activity because, one, he wanted to be a throwback, and two, it kept him out of trouble. It kept him on the straight and narrow, kept him on the gym and kept him focused. So James, I think, had a predilection for making some poor lifestyle choices, and that was one way kind of to keep him aligned.
Yeah, well, as I said again, from the Hall of Fame speech that he did, that's what he said. Sorry, Tazzy, go ahead, mate.
I want to mention something in the first fight. In the crowd, you will not believe it, Donald Trump is there in the first fight. He's at his casino. Sitting next to the head of the Philadelphia mob, Nicky Scarfo.
Is that right?
Go back and watch the first fight, Mikey. You see Ivana Trump, you see Donald Trump, and next to him is the head of the Philly mob, who would have been running Atlantic City, because Atlantic City was run by the Philly mob, Nicky Nicodino Scarfo.
Okay, well, we're not talking politics on the show though, so we'll move on from that. But that's fascinating.
Not politics, but I'm just saying, like, it's crazy. He's sitting there with the head of the Philly mob, like, just unbelievable. Just never noticed it before. Yeah.
I think even I watched the. I know we're getting off topic here, Mike, but I watched the Offer the other week, the story of the Godfather, and they were associating with the head of the mob and all that there when they were doing the Godfather, which is unusual out in the open, and good mates. So it's amazing. Back then you wouldn't get away with it now, of course, in the days of social media, because they'd be all over you. And anyway, let's not talk about that. So, Mike, the thoughts about the second fight. We'll get to the decision in a second. What were your thoughts on it and who won?
I thought that this one was actually a bit clearer than the first fight. If anything, just probably by a round. I had this like an 8-4, 9-3 for James Toney. And obviously you see here late, McCALLUM having some moments. There's still a little bit left in the locker. But the general sentiment within the industry at this stage was that maybe McCALLUM had seen the best of his days. Obviously, a lot of those people didn't realise, especially us in Australia, didn't realise what he was going to do to one of our most treasured heroes, and then still remain a fixture at the elite of world boxing for a number of more years. But I think that this was a bit of redemption for Toney, and there you see Jackie Callan there. During better times with her and James celebrating, there's a lot of controversy on their fallout in years later, but I can only imagine James Toney would have been an absolute handful to manage at the best of times during his prime.
100%. So the final scores were 117, 110 times 2, which is pretty accurate. The other one was 114, 114. Go ahead, Tassie. Go, Tassie. Go ahead, mate. Nope, I can't hear you, Tassie.
No, how do they end up? I forget the story, Mike. How do they end up?
Well, James wound up driving to her house with a gun and threatening her. And post that, it was after, I think, maybe either the first or second fight with Montel Griffin. But there was tension brewing for a long time. And I always say this with athletes, you see how their worlds fall apart when they deal with adversity. And I think that Tony, post that first career loss to Roy Jones, struggled there for a number of years to find consistency in his life and had probably a lot of bad influences, on the outside affected him. And who knows? I mean, we're just going off what's in a public light. You never know what's personally discussed or what tensions build between two people in a working relationship. But it was a shame because, what he had accomplished with Jackie as his manager, Jackie had started as head of PR at the Kronk Gym and built her way up and managed a number of fighters, that are long forgotten now. But Tony was really her first fighter that hit through to what you'd say is like the A tier. And there was so much positive press out there about him building up to his rise as a great champion that it was a shame to see the way it ended.
Yeah, no, it was. Well, let's get on to the third fight while we're talking there, guys. And one thing I'll note here, Tassie, is that you'll see straight away it's the size difference. Considerably bigger boys. This was for the WBU cruiserweight title. So in the WBU, we're trying to make a bit of a move. Obviously, the move didn't last too long, but this took place February 22nd, 1997, so nearly 5 years after the second one. It was at the Mohegan Sun Casino in Uncasville, I think I pronounced that right, in Connecticut. It was, so a long way from Reno or Atlantic City. Tony was 53-3-2, so he'd had 20 fights or 21 fights since they last met. McCALLUM was 49-4-1, so he'd only had the 6 fights. But yeah, just a few extra pounds put on there, Tassie. No, Tassie. Can you hear us there, Tassie?
3 divisions there, mate. That's crazy. Wow.
Yeah. What about you, Mike? I mean, the one thing I sort of found apart from the weight was just how much slower they looked, and I mean, the amount of punches. Obviously, the volume would slow down as well.
A little bit more plotting, although you've seen on the graphic there before, between them 150 punches thrown in the opening stanza. That's a pretty high work rate by any weight class in any era. So both of them still brought volume, but I think they're more measured in their attacks. Like you said, I mean, just a little bit more plotting in their movements, but both of them are still class acts inside the squared circle. You got McCALLUM, who's 40 years of age here, but he's still physically intact, still knows his way around the ring. And this was kind of an interesting period in James Toney's career because he was considered to be post-prime, but what he went on to accomplish, a decade plus post this fight is just out of this universe.
Yeah, well, no wonder he was in the Hall of Fame. And Tassie, McCALLUM had only, I think, a couple of fights before this had beat now man Jeff Harding, so he's obviously still in pretty good form. You're on a bit of delay there, I think, Tassie. Can you hear me there, mate?
Yeah. I might go out and come back in.
Okay, mate. Yep. So, Mike, you can answer that question if you can remember what I just said.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, he won that title over Harding. Had what you'd consider like a few nondescript defenses. McCALLUM was kind of the antithesis to what we're discussing with Tony earlier, that he had a lot of lulls in his career. One fight a year, one fight every 18 months, things of that nature. And so he probably never maximized his potential. But he was still fresh. I mean, he had that close decision loss, was it to Fabrice Tiozzo, where he dropped that world championship. But he had still pushed Roy Jones 12 rounds, lost every round, but still hung in there with a prime Roy Jones, and was still a decent fighter, was still probably top 5 to 8 in the world, thereabouts at this stage of his career, despite being so far post-prime.
Well, I think too, Tassie, can you hear us there, mate? You're okay?
Yeah.
So, look, you mentioned the Roy Jones Jr. fight there, Mike. So, Tassie, yeah, he'd come off that fight. That was actually light heavyweight. I think one thing to note here, even though they were both cruiserweights, they only weighed 181 and 182 respectively. And I think, what's the cruiserweight limit? 190. So, they were actually small middleweights. Yeah. But, yeah, for the stage of their careers, still not a bad scrap.
Yeah, well, look, with Tony went on to beat Jirov and, and went up and stopped Holyfield as a heavyweight and won a version of the heavyweight world title as well. So Tony carried the weight really well. Like he was that fast for that weight. He was such a good in-fighter, and he used the weight. He used his skills well at that weight. He carried it really well.
Yeah, he did. Well, this is, as I said, fight number 3. As I said, the WBU Cruiserweight title. Mike, is the WBU still around, or was it just a short-lived title?
No, the president, was it John Robinson, passed away, I dare say late 90s, maybe late 90s, early 2000s. If you remember, the belt became particularly popular in the UK, and usually that's a sign. If it's a WBU, IBO, whatever these belts, these trinkets become popular in the UK, South Africa, places like that, generally you can see that they're not the real deal, so they're utilized by promoters to sell tickets, and it is what it is. The WBU at this stage was still fighting for credibility, so they kind of built the entity off of the fact that was a world championship George Foreman carried. So once George Foreman was recognized heavyweight world champion, he vacated the belts because he didn't want to make his mandatory defenses, and only held the WBU title. So that kind of is what gave him credibility, similar to like how Roy Jones, Vladimir Klitschko had the IBO title, but by no stretch was this considered a legitimate, recognized world championship at this particular time when they were fighting.
I think, is this the title also that Mickey Ward won?
Yeah, it's a title he won against Shane Neary in 2000, I believe.
Of course,
Ricky Hatton held it for ages, and he was recognised as a world champion before he fought Costa Zoo in the English people's eyes. He defended the WBU belt and would pack out arenas in Manchester ages before he fought Costa and won a legitimate title.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I must admit, I've never really heard too much about it, but this obviously was...
Remember that, Mike? Ricky Hatton?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's what I was saying. Like, it was Foreman who kind of started the trend, and then that belt became a fixture in the UK for years. Similar, we've seen a revolving door from IBO to WBF to WBU. At various stages of the IBA, you can kind of just, toss the letters around, and you come up with these belts, and legitimate fighters win them at times. Of course, here, Tony, future cruiserweight world champ, recognised cruiserweight world champ, won a version of the heavyweight title too, but yeah, this reign will be recognised by nobody as a real world title.
Well, this is the final round, so the scores in this one, again, I thought Tony won the fight clearly, but it was 115, 113 times 2, and 117, 111 for Tony. So after this, Tassie, so Mike McCALLUM, this was actually his final fight, so he finished with a 53-3-2 record. James Toney, though, as you said before, Mike, he went on and had it's probably too much to sort of go over now, but he obviously had that infamous fight with John Ruiz when he got disqualified after the fact for the banned substances. He beat Holyfield. Obviously, even come to Australia, Mike, and fought Lucas Brown. So he had an eventful career.
Let's not mention that fight. Let's not mention
Were you there? I never saw it.
I was with James Toney the day of the weigh-in, and I told everyone who asked me that he was going to get beat because he just, even just in his speech and his movements and everything, he had slowed dramatically. And to me, it's a sad moment in history.
Yeah.
It just wasn't the guy that I grew up watching. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to look at what weight he was here when he fought him. 250 pounds. He weighed 200. That's 90 pounds over when he first won the world title.
Yeah, the less we speak about that belt, the better, I think.
Yeah, and I think he probably weigh more like 350 these days. Saw him at the Hall of Fame. He's a big boy now, and I still wouldn't mess with him though. He's a bad man, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And legend to me, it's always painful when you see these legendary fighters just lose to guys that are far beneath them in their prime. At least with McCALLUM. So back on topic of what we're discussing. At least with McCALLUM. Yeah, the versions of him that fought TONEY at the end and Teozzo and Roy Jones wasn't prime McCALLUM by any stretch, but he's losing on points to guys that were world champions, and we can live with that.
Yeah.
But when you see, like when you see Ali lose to Berbick, even though Berbick was a future world champion, that breaks your heart. When you see, last week we talked about Aaron Pryor, and I told you the controversy of that, but still when he loses to Bobby Joe Young, when James Toney loses, forget Lucas Brown, when James Toney loses to, was it Charles Ellis and Jason Gavin, it's like, what on earth is happening? It just, everything feels wrong with your world. But I hope that when people look back at these fighters, yeah, that's another one. Like I just hope that when people look back at these fighters, they judge them and appreciate them by their best. So if you want to watch Toney, you want to watch McCALLUM, go watch their first fight. That's the one to hone in on.
No, I agree. Well, Tassie, mate, great choice. We had a little bit of an adventure there with you coming in and out a bit, but we got there in the end. As I said, great choice in this fight, and maybe go back and revisit, which I haven't done for quite a few years. So thanks for that, mate. And the MGA up there, that's obviously your brand, Mike. You're up next. I'm assuming you're around next week?
Yeah, I've got to actually think. You got me on the spot. I've got to think.
Okay, don't have to tell us now. That's fine.
I can work through it in my head. I'm just not sure what's been covered during my absence. So I'll come back to you on that.
You have to get on YouTube and check them out. But no, I think we'll get away from maybe mentioning the following week's one. We'll let it be a surprise, so we can have a really good think about it, because there's plenty of obviously classic fights out there. As I said, last week's Pacquiao Marquez series was good, and of course this one now. So have a think about it, mate. I'm glad we've got you for a few more weeks. Tassie, great to have you back as well, mate. And we'll see you both next week. See you, boys.
See you, boys.